são imediatas. Reduza suas incertezas com a maior empresa do Brasil de administração contratual. Exxata. Atitude imediata, resultados notáveis.
Você atua com contratos, perícias ou projetos complexos? A Exxata, referência nacional de gestão contratual e solução de conflitos, acaba de lançar o curso de administração contratual. É um curso feito para profissionais técnicos e jurídicos que querem dominar os bastidores dos contratos, interpretar cláusulas críticas com segurança e atuar com mais autoridade em projetos de alto nível. Você vai aprender a administrar contratos com base técnica, elaborar pareceres consistentes, conduzir a análise de desequilíbrio econômico-financeiro e atuar em disputas com confiança. Tudo com linguagem prática, exemplos reais e a experiência de quem participou de mais de 1.200 projetos no Brasil. E o melhor, você tem acesso imediato ao curso por investimento acessível, direto na plataforma Hotmart. Se você quer crescer na carreira técnica ou gerencial, essa é sua oportunidade. Garanta sua vaga agora, as inscrições são por tempo limitado. Te espero lá!
Bom dia, pessoal, tudo bem com vocês? Sejam bem-vindos à nossa primeira live internacional da Exxata. Um prazer poder novamente começar a apresentar a todos. Para começar, para a gente poder já fazer esse aquecimento, que é de prática das nossas lives, dos nossos webinars, peço para que sempre compartilhem no nosso chat aí do YouTube, no LinkedIn, onde vocês estiverem assistindo, qual cidade, qual empresa, qual escritório vocês estão assistindo, né? Hoje acredito que teremos uma presença maior aí dos nossos amigos do direito. E hoje para poder falar sobre um tema que eu acredito que desperta muita atenção de todos, que é as grandes construções, né, as grandes disputas internacionais. Hoje a gente trouxe a Gunjan, nossa parceira da Converra, para poder bater um papo com a gente. E como vai ser uma live internacional, eu trouxe a ajuda aqui da Isadora, que é do nosso time, para poder me ajudar a apresentar e iniciar a apresentação da Gunjan. Bem-vindo,
Hi
Luiz.
everyone, good morning.
Bom, e junto da Gunjan, hoje nós vamos trazer uma pessoa aqui que eu acredito que já seja figurinha carimbada aqui da Exxata, todo mundo conhece bastante, que é a Fernanda. Ela é sócia da Exxata, ela está aqui conosco já há quase 10 anos, tem experiência em mais de 200 perícias judiciais e arbitrais. Semana passada eu estava em Paris, apresentando no Paris Arbitration Week. Também outra palestra em inglês. A Fernanda está extremamente treinada, está acostumada já a falar em público. Eu tenho certeza que vai ser uma ótima apresentação. O conteúdo está muito legal, viu, gente? Tem dicas práticas do que pode já sair aqui da live e verificar no seu contrato. A gente vai falar sobre contrato FDICs, vai falar sobre contratos internacionais, tem a apresentação de 4 cases. Então, eu recomendo bastante que vocês fiquem até o final, o conteúdo realmente está muito legal. Bem-vindo, Fernanda.
Hi. Oi, pessoal. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Have you allowed Gunjan into the room as well? Because
Yes, I'm going to presentation.
Yes, it's a pleasure to welcome Gunjan Chellani, She is Director of Advisory, Consultant, and Expert Service at Converra, our partner. With 15 years of experience in construction industry, she has extensive expertise in contracts, claims, dispute resolution, delay analysis, quantum and BYM advisory across the Gulf Cooperation Council, Southeast Asia, and Australia. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation. I'm sure it will be a very valuable webinar. Hi,
Hi, Gunjan.
welcome, Gunjan.
Hello, thanks Isadora. Thank you so much, Andre and Isadora, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the today's webinar between Converra and Exxata, Brazil. I am Gunjan Chellani, Director at Converra, focused on advisory, consulting, and expert services across the GCC. And with me, I have Fernanda, partner at Exxata, bringing close to a decade of deep local expertise in Brazilian construction dispute. What we are going to do today is a little bit different from a standard legal or technical seminar. We are using 4 real mega projects. 2 from those are from Saudi and 2 from Brazil as case studies to show you what actually determines who wins and who loses in construction disputes. By the end of today, you will have a practical framework you can take with you on your projects and apply from tomorrow. Next. The agenda today we have is the session is structured into 8 modules. We will first set the global context, why this era of mega projects create dispute almost by design. We will then review the top causes of claim globally before going into the heart of the session, that is the 4 case studies drawn from the live projects. We will then draw battlefield lessons together, documentation, FIDIC strategy, forensic delay analysis, quantum methodology, and close with our expert witness module and the integrated 5-pillar methodology, which Converra and Exxata use across all our segments. Please drop your questions in the chat as we go, and we will answer them at the end towards the question and answer rounds. I now pass on the stage to Fernanda to take up the modules and take the session forward. Thanks.
Okay, so moving on. First, I just want to thank everyone that has joined us today in this webinar. I know it's a little unusual for everyone that knows me, see me here speaking English, but I hope everyone can follow the webinar as well as possible. And if we can just skip the slide and go straight to the first module. So basically today what we're going to be discussing is pretty much how in these environments of heavy conflict, how can we better structure our claims to make sure that they will work and that they will have the correct methodology so that we can succeed, whether it's during a negotiation phase or whether it's during an arbitral procedure or a judicial claim or whatever it is. We just want to make sure that we have a grounded claim to make sure that it will succeed later. So before we move into some specific details about how that can be done, I think it's very important to understand the broader context in which these projects exist. So I brought some data from different researches that are done, some of them in specific environments such as North America or Europe, but some of them with global data from global construction contracts. And the first data that we have is that according to Oxford Economics, global construction is expected to reach about $15 trillion of spends annually by 2030. So that financial expansion just means that we're bound to have more projects, larger contracts, and that definitely creates a more complex environment. Another data that we have is that we had a study done in 2023, and that study analyzed over 6,000 projects around the world. And basically what they found was that only 1% of all the projects and all the contracts that they analyzed were actually concluded within the planned budget and within the planned schedule. We have another data that is from a research done internally by McKinsey, and they found that about 45% of all their capital projects actually exceeded the initial budget. So basically, those two numbers are showing us that most of the projects will have changes in schedule and in cost. A different data from Arcadis shows that the average value of construction disputes actually exceeds about $50 million. And that number has actually increased over the last years. In the last 2 years, we've had an increase of over 40% in the value of the disputes that actually do go to some kind of formal discussion, such as arbitration or judicial claims. A different study done by Oxford indicated that the average schedule overrun in large construction projects is of around 3.4 years. There's a specific study that was done in the Europe Union, and that only analyzed very large public administration contracts, and they found a number that most of their contracts actually exceeded 10 years regarding the initial schedule. So that's a really long time. So that's definitely something that everyone has faced, which is a time extension. And basically what the studies are showing is that these time extensions, they can be very long. When we look at disputes specifically, their average duration in North America was of 15 months. We have a specific study done in Brazil by CBC, and they show that the average duration of arbitrations is about 26.5 months. So also a very long time. So basically what we see when we put all of these numbers together is basically that the construction environment is getting bigger. We are having more complex contracts, and these projects will almost certainly face some kind of change, whether it is in cost or whether it is on the schedule. Those changes are bound to happen throughout the execution of the project. Some of these changes, they can actually become massive claims, and if these claims are not resolved in time, they can actually escalate and become arbitration procedures or the judicial claims that will definitely take a very long time to be resolved. In that environment, the ability to correctly identify the risks and to actually produce documents that will correctly evidence the events of impact that happen throughout the project so that you can later structure their claims in a very strategic way becomes a decisive advantage. So that's the main topic that we will be discussing. You can go to the next slide. So the question that comes when we look at the data from the previous slide is pretty much what is actually triggering all of those changes, and is there anything that can be done to lower the need for those changes? So this slide summarizes the data that was compiled by HKA. HKA did a global research analyzing a lot of contracts, and basically they reached the conclusion that the main causes for claims in construction projects are the ones summarized in that table. When we look at it, it may seem like we have a lot of different causes for claims, but basically what they show is like if we combine the first 5 items of that table, which is changes in scope, the incorrect designs, design information that was issued late, design that was incomplete, we can see that a big part of the changes that result in claims are actually design related. This tells us something that's very important, which is that most of the claims are not really generated during the executions. They are actually technical and project problems that already exist once the contract is signed, and that can later on become massive claims. So some of these other causes are actually related to the project life cycle. So we can have interfaces between contractors, designers, that can also be a cause. We can also have physical conditions that weren't foreseen, but that can also be seen as a design problem. So the key takeaway here is that these disputes, they will start on the project site and when the project is being defined and built and when the contract is being signed. So it is important to take that into consideration whenever you're entering a new contract. And most importantly, it's pretty much unavoidable that these changes in design will happen. So the main takeaway is just be aware of what is actually stated in the design and of what actually was agreed upon in the contract, so that when these changes do happen during the execution of the project, you can quickly identify them and you can quickly renegotiate the terms of the contract. On the next slide, I think Gunjan, well, we brought here 4 specific case studies. We will be going through each one of them, basically just to put into a reality context some of these changes that can happen in projects and how these changes can be held. Gunjan will go over the first 2 case studies, and I will go through case study number 3 and 4. So take it away.
Thanks, Fernanda. Well, as nicely and precisely put by Fernanda about various disputes that we are facing these days, and the bigger the project, the complex it is, and how the documentation plays a vital role, be it in understanding or be it in actually administering it. That is what now we will see in this particular project, which is a very ambitious project, which had a planned linear city in northwest Saudi Arabia with a total envisioned investment exceeding $500 billion. So the engineering scale is genuinely unprecedented, because here we are talking about 170 kilometers of urban development in remote terrain, requiring labor mobilization on a scale that had no comparable precedent. So things started getting staggered in this, and the issues are familiar to many of you. However, in the current stage, it is just on an unfamiliar scale, because we are talking about a 170-kilometer linear development. So the design was not frozen at the contract stage. The scope expanded substantially post the contract award as the project vision evolved, and acceleration directives were issued without being the formal variation orders in place. Labor productivity assumptions modeled on inaccessible project environment proved to be a bit unrealistic on the remote terrain. So when these delays get accumulated, concurrent causation becomes contested with the owner, contractor, or any third party who are involved in the project. The broader context of this project is well documented. However, upon the significant budget reassessment at the program level resulted in a contract terminations of multiple packages. And the contractors are now pursuing recovery through formal commercial claims. This is the environment that those who were not prepared are navigating. So, as you can see on the right side of the screen, what will be the winning strategies in this particular case? As they all point to the same conclusion, that the contractors who maintained robust contemporaneous record, served the FIDIC Clause 20 notices strictly on time, engaged DABs early to preserve commercial relationship, and built quantum on actual cost record rather than program-only claims, those are the ones who are likely to recover. And the key lesson at the banner of the bottom, as you can see here, is that the dispute is not won or lost in the first 90 days. It is contemporaneous record and FIDIC notice compliance, which is a non-negotiable technique here. Let's move on to the next case study, which is the another ambitious project, which is Riyadh Metro in Saudi Arabia. So this is a $22.5 billion project, which is with a 6-lane urban transit system. It's one of the largest transport infrastructure project ever delivered. Now, in the earlier slide, we were talking about the issues those can happen between various stakeholders of the project. But in this particular case, we will focus on one of the primary aspect, which is the multi-party JV accountability gaps. So this project involved multiple international joint venture consortia working across different packages under a highly complex employer-contractor interface. As we can see, there are 4 lessons those are learned from this particular project. The first one is that the JV accountability gaps do matter. So when a partner is in a JV, begin disputing internal liability allocation between themselves, the employer gets benefited directly because the delay is presenting a unified claim weakens the contractor's position. So the lesson that we have here is that the JV dispute resolution protocol must be agreed before mobilization, not after the first delay event. So as Fernanda was pointing about the major disputes, those are happening in the mega projects, that we should take care of the design and the contract. It is also the internal policies between the JV partners. Those should be streamlined right from day one. The second learning from this project is the engineers' determinations, those were being challenged. So the interim payment certificate were systematically under-certified. The contractor who recovered were those who were submitting a detailed item-by-item record of every certified versus claim amount with full substantiation. However, those who argued just on general items were having a weaker position. The third learning from this particular case study is regarding the concurrent delay, which is weaponized by both the sides. So the winning party used a time impact analysis with contemporaneous project records to demonstrate net contractor entitlement, which is a forensic argument and not a narrative one. And the fourth last learning from this case is that the subcontractor's back-to-back exposure is very vital for any of the contractor when bringing any subcontractor on board. The main contractors who had not structured back-to-back delay liability through their supply chain absorbed losses that should have flowed downward. This is a contract structuring issue. It cannot be fixed retrospectively once the dispute has crystallized. So again, it brings us back to the simple formula that we have to streamline all the internal and external processes, be it upstream or downstream, right from day one. Now I pass on the stage to Fernanda to take up the next two case studies.
Well, moving on to case study number 3, we now look at some of the Brazilian projects, both case studies, project 3 and project 4. We've deducted the specific names of the places and of the parties involved just to maintain confidentiality. But looking specifically at case 3, we are discussing the construction of a terminal and the facilities from specific refinery in Brazil, and also the execution of all the associated pipeline infrastructure of that refinery. This was a very large project. It had a planned duration of 700 days and a planned cost of approximately 300 million reais. So what makes this project particularly interesting is that it had a very high contractual complexity. Over the course of the execution of the project, the contract had over 29 amendments, which already is an indicative that the project had significant changes in scope and in conditions during the construction phase. And in this case, the core problem was that the quality and completeness of the basic design that was provided by the owner was not very good. So pretty much the basic design was not really completed. And it also had a lot of inconsistencies, pretty much because they didn't really coordinate well the different services that would have to be executed. So you pretty much had basic civil designs that didn't really communicate with the basic infrastructure pipeline designs. So that created the need for a lot of significant changes in the designs that were provided, and that resulted in these 29 amendments. So as a result of all of these changes, you started to have a lot of significant impacts in the execution. So from a dispute perspective, this is a very typical situation when we think about mega projects, because you had a lot of overlapping events. You could have different potential responsibility from both parties, because you could have the responsibility of the owner regarding the design, but you could also partially have a responsibility of the contractor due to pretty much a low productivity or not having the needed resources to do the activities that were actually available. So you could have a case of divided responsibilities. And also that created a hard time isolating the impacts that were actually caused by the owner and by the design problems, and how these isolated impacts resulted in additional deadlines and additional costs. So you had it was very difficult to isolate these events and to actually understand how these specific events impacted the cost and the schedule. So in cases like this, a major problem can be isolating these events, but also clearly identify when these events happened and exactly what activities were impacted by each one of these design changes. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to have a look at pretty much what we did in this project. So we had to do a structured technical analysis pretty much to prove when these impacts happened and how specifically they affected each one of the activities that were in execution at that moment. Because we had 4 major fronts of service being executed at the same time, it was important to separate those work fronts and to separate which one of these impacts actually affected each one of these service fronts. And in large construction disputes, it's very common for you to have multiple issues happening at the same time. And if you don't isolate those events properly, you can just pretty much mix everything together, and then you might have a hard time defining who's responsible for what. So we pretty much broke down the contract front by front and also period by period. So we mapped out all the technical events that could ultimately affect the project. So that included problems with the basic design, problems with the automation system, problems in providing the needed equipment. Everything was correctly analyzed, and we saw if each one of these events were correctly proven, and if we had enough documents to prove at exactly what time these impacts happened. And then we pretty much ended with a timeline of the events that we could prove. And then we started to link each one of these events to a specific activity that was being executed and that could be impacted by each one of those events. And once we did that, we could prove that specific periods of time during the contract were impacted by specific events that happened previously. So once we structured all of this analysis, we were pretty much able to separate the different types of impacts that we had. So we could pretty much separate everything that was owner caused from everything that could potentially be caused by the contractor itself. This kind of structured approach and this kind of analysis is essential in disputes. So it's not enough to simply prove that these events of impact happen. It is also very important to demonstrate exactly how these problems became impacts of delay concerning the schedule and how each one of these events actually resulted in any kind of additional cost. On the next case study, we will be analyzing a metro infrastructure project in Brazil. These case files are actually public because it was a contract with the public administration. And it was a project that was initially scheduled to be an 18-month project, and it had a contractual value of 200 million reais. But during the execution of the project, there was a very significant schedule expansion, and the final duration of the project was actually from approximately 72 months, which means that the project lasted about 4 times longer than what was originally planned. And when we look at the reasons behind this time extension, what we see is that a lot of these changes are actually very common in infrastructure projects and actually relate to some of the data that I've shown in previous slides. So the first problem they had was a continuous need for project revisions, because there were some projects with the basic designs that were provided, and also because the projects weren't as fully developed when the contract was signed. And that created the second problem, which was that during the execution of the project, a lot of additional works had to be incorporated, and that created the need for additional deadlines. Another problem that they had, which is also very common in Brazil, especially when we look at contracts with the public administration, was access restrictions. So they needed to change the sequence of execution of the contract because there were some area restraints. There was also a lot of problems with public utility concessionaries, and also problems with the environmental licensing. All of these problems, as I say them, these are problems that we have seen occur not in one, but in so many mega projects that we see in Brazil. So these are all very common projects in construction. And pretty much everyone that's watching this live has faced one of these problems at some point in time. Another problem that we also see happening a lot is that due to these problems, the schedule changed and they started facing rainfalls in times that they didn't expect it to be facing rainfalls, and they also had above average rainfalls. And so when we look at this case as a whole, what we see is that, like all of the other projects, and like I mentioned, a lot of times these construction projects are not affected by only one problem, but by a combination of multiple factors. And that is why infrastructure disputes are so complex, because the challenge is not usually identifying that these changes happen, that these problems happen. The challenge is usually untangling all of these overlapping causes and really finding the impacts of each one of these causes. So moving on, after looking at these case studies and with the experience that we have, a question that we are commonly asked is, why do some claims succeed and some claims fail? Well, here we gathered some lessons that we've had from different claim negotiations and from different arbitration procedure, everything that we've experienced in my experience, over the last 10 years, but given Exxata's history over the last 15 years. And what we see, the first lesson that we have, is that documents really are game changer. In most cases, the party that can actually prove that these events happened, and more specifically, prove that they happened using records that were made on the time that those impacts were happening, those cases usually have a higher chance of success. Because although we can reconstruct some of the documents afterwards, it's definitely more believable when we have documents that correctly prove that these events happened and how they impacted the contract if they were done when these events were actually happening. Contract strategy is also important, particularly when we have FIDIC projects or similar international contracts. And so looking at how the parties manage notifications and variations and how they follow the contractual procedures throughout the project is very important. The third element is forensic delay analysis. Gunjan will talk a little bit more about that carrying on, but it's very important not just to show that these events of impact happened, but also how they impacted the schedule and how they affected the critical path of the project. The fourth principle is how we can quantify each one of these impacts and really translate them into a financial analysis. And finally, we have the fifth element being the role of the expert witness, especially when we look at arbitration cases. The credibility and the ability of the expert to actually make their point to the tribunal is something that can definitely play a decisive role in how in whether we will succeed or not during the procedure. So on the next slide, I will talk a little bit more about the first lesson, which is how important the documentation is. So when we specifically thinking about arbitration procedures, the tribunals, they will rarely decide, like I said, they usually don't make the decision based on documents that were constructed during the arbitration procedure. Is more common for them to use documents that were built and presented at the time of the contract during the execution. So with that in mind, I will go through some of the main sources of documents in a construction project. However, even before going through each one of those documents, I would like to highlight that even though I'm going through 4 types of documents that are presented and that commonly exist during a contract, there's so many more types of documents that are generated within a construction contract, and they all matter. It's not very rare, especially nowadays, for us to see, for example, WhatsApp conversations being used to prove that a change happened or to prove that the parties had a specific agreement about a design or about a specific clause of the contract. So that's just to give an example of how important each and every document that is generated in the contract matters. I think that the main takeaway here is that we need to really use all of the documents and all of the possible records that we can create during the construction according to their goal. So, for example, when we think about the daily project records, the main goal of the daily project record is just creating a record of what actually happened during that specific day. You need to document weather conditions, the resources that you had on that day. It's very important to add photographies, and sometimes we even see nowadays some people adding videos to daily project records to show what services were actually executed on that day and what resources were available. It is not a good idea to turn the daily project records into a battlefield. It's very common for us to look specific. That's even more common when we think about old projects from 10 years ago or maybe more. It is very common for us to have one comment from the contractor saying that they suffered a specific impact, and then you have a response from the owner saying that that impact simply did not happen. So if you turn these daily records into a battlefield, it is very common to not really know what happened during the day, because you will have one contractor from one side saying one thing happened, and then you will have the owner on the other side saying that a completely different thing happened. So and then when that happens, you pretty much can't use the daily project records for pretty much anything, because they lose all credibility and you don't know what informations are reliable or not. So focus on actually registering on the daily record the things that really matter. I think that on Exxata's website, I'm not sure if it's still on the website, but if anyone is interested, you can just comment on the chat. We have a specific form that shows how daily project records should be filed and what types of information should be on these daily project records. So if anyone is interested, just comment on the chat and we can send that afterwards. And just moving on to other types of documents that we have during a contract, we also have a lot of program management documents, and it's very important to have regular progress updates that are being presented to the owner. For example, when we think about schedules, it's very important to show how the schedule is actually evolving. It is very common for us to look at contracts that have already ended, and then when we look at the schedule just simply doesn't show what was actually happening on the contract, or are not reliable enough. Sometimes because the impacts were happening, but the contractor didn't want to show how that would in fact impact the deadlines of the activities. So they would just completely transform the schedule into something that cannot technically be analyzed. So it's important to stay truthful to what's actually happening in the contract, in the schedule, and in all other program management documents that are presented. Contractual correspondences are also important, especially under international contracts that create obligations to notify some of the events and some of the changes in the moment that they happen. In arbitration procedures and looking back at the contract, these correspondences, they are particularly useful when they actually have evidence of everything that is being said in the correspondence. So maybe the correspondence is in itself, it's not that reliable when we're thinking about retrospective delay analysis and retrospective claims, but it's more about how they can create evidence or how they presented evidence to some of the impacts and some of the effects of the impacts as they were happening. And at the end, it's very important to have financial records, because in a lot of cases we can prove that the impact happened, we can prove that the event happened and that impacted the contract, but we can't really quantify financially what that effect was. So it's important to also have all of those documents at hand. And these documents are really the foundation of a successful claim. The next lesson on the next slide is regarding the contract. Here we brought some clauses that are usually common when we think about FIDIC contracts, but these are just clauses that are also common in other types of contracts that we see in Brazil. I would like to highlight only a few of them, and the first one is the clause that regards extension of time. The main takeaway is that it's important to be alert on what the contract says regarding extension of times, because in many cases, if the delay hasn't been properly notified when it actually happened, you may lose the entitlement to any claims related to that extension of time afterwards. Also, when we think about variations and adjustments, it's also important to notify and to properly formalize that these variations happened. And when we think about claims, it's also very common for us to have specific deadlines for the presentation of claims, and these deadlines usually count from the moment that the impact happened. And in FIDIC contracts, we usually have the 28-day notice period, but we've seen in Brazilian contracts periods that are actually smaller. We've seen 7 days. We even had contracts where they only had 3 days to notify the impacts that each event had on the contract. So it's very important to be aware of those deadlines, because they can also change how the claims are perceived afterwards. There are other clauses, but I will not go through all of them. The main point here is just to make sure that the parties have a full understanding of what obligations they have under the contract, so that they can correctly follow their obligations, and also that they can correctly activate some of the mechanisms that are foreseen in the contract during the project. Because when you do need to present a claim and when you do need to discuss a claim, you will be in a stronger position if you have complied with all the obligations that you had under the contract. Moving on, I think Gunjan can talk about that.
Thanks, Fernanda. So as we see about the lesson 3, which is the forensic delay analysis, and why choosing a delay analysis is important, because any wrong analysis can undermine an otherwise strong claim. So as we can see, the first one is the impacted as planned and collapsed as built. They are acceptable. However, the first one is accepted as an early stage TIA for the notice purpose, but as you can see, it does not reflect the actual project dynamics. And when we talk about the collapsed as built analysis, it is acceptable for retrospective analysis, but can be challenged as the logic dependent and it is susceptible to manipulation. The third most common practice is the as planned as built. It is a simple and low cost technique, but it ignores the causation and is frequently rejected by the tribunals on the major claim. So then this brings us to the two golden standards, which are the time impact analysis. This is a prospective analysis showing the impact of each delay event as it occurs. However, it is resource intensive. And when we talk about the window analysis, this is the highest credibility methodology for arbitration because we are breaking the projects into time windows and isolating the causation at each stage with a greater forensic rigor. The point here is it's not about the type of methodology, but also the critical point here is about the timing. These methodologies need to be running from the project commencement. So if you are beginning a window analysis 3 years after the fact, using reconstructed program records, the quality and credibility of the output is materially compromised. In general, Converha uses window analysis and APAB as the standard on the expert witness engagements. We move on to the next lesson, which is the quantum assessment on how we should build a claim that withstands scrutiny. On the screen, you will see a slide that is presented as a mirror. The left column captures what wins in arbitration, and the right column captures what consistently fails. The contrast between the two is where the lesson sits, and which is what we are trying to convey today through this webinar. So on the winning side, as you can see, the foundation is discrete. We have to do item by item costing. The arbitral tribunals have consistently rejected the claims wherein the claimant says that I have claimed X amount, but I have been paid Y amount, and difference of both is the claim that is to be made. Such claims prove nothing but about causation. So what wins instead is a quantum built on actual cost records supported by audited codes and invoices. In case of disruption, if there is any productivity loss that is in dispute, measured mile analysis is an accepted approach. When it comes to prolongation cost and acceleration cost, they must be clearly separated and never mixed without explanation. So one of the biggest risks that generally happens in any of the claim submission is the duplication in the cost. So it is very vital to record the cost and isolate them based on the claims in order to make your claim local rather than global for the submission. The preliminary cost, direct site cost, and head office overhead each need to stand on their own distinctly categorization. Where concurrent delay affects the quantum, the apportionment methodology must be transparent and explicitly reasoned. Finance charges, whether compound or simple interest, must be argued explicitly rather than assumed. On the falling side, if we see, the pattern is equally consistent. So people rely on estimation rather than the actual cost, and that undermines the credibility of at the outset. So claiming loss of profit on a work that was never executed will never survive scrutiny. Using tender rates for extra work without a rate escalation analysis ignores commercial reality. So failing to demonstrate that mitigation efforts were made exposes the claimant to a reduction in recovery. The overclaiming of preliminary by treating fixed cost as though they were time related is one of the most common and most avoidable mistake we see in practice. So the conclusion that we come across, say every jurisdiction is the same, that the claim needs to be specific and not general and not opaque. We move on to the next lesson, which is when we land in the arbitration and the expert witness edge comes into play. So the expert witness is often a decisive factor in a claim, even when the underlying entitlement is sound. So there are 4 dimensions that define difference between a credible expert and the one who creates damage to their client's case. The first one, as we see, is the independence and objectivity. So the expert's duty is to the tribunal, first of all. It's not to the party who has appointed them. Acknowledging weakness openly and genuinely makes the expert far more credible with the tribunal. and not less. Never adopt the client's language verbatim, because as we say, there is nothing right or wrong in any expert report. It's the evidence that proves what is being analyzed. So the bottom line here is to operate under the guideline on the party appointed expert as the baseline standard. The next is the technical credibility. The methodology must be reproducible by an independent reviewer. Cite sources, for example, SCL protocols, the AAC guidelines, and quantify uncertainty where it exists, because it is the precision that wins over overstatement every time. The next is the communication under the cross-examination. So the expert has to provide the concise answers, resist over elaboration, use visual aids, timelines, charts, graphics, to cross by the knowing your weaknesses. Because the arbitrators watch demeanor as closely as they follow the technical argument. And last but not the least is the report structure. So first of all, the executive summary in the report has to be clear and concise, because that is what the arbitrator reads first. Tabulated issues agreed and the issues those are disputed. Appendices with full supporting data. And then joint expert meeting used productively, as these can be decisive in narrowing the battleground before the hearing begins. Based on these learnings, we now move on to the next module, which is the winning framework. So this module brings everything as we have discussed today into an integrated methodology. What Converha and Exxata have developed and applied across various projects in GCC, Southeast Asia, Latin America is a 5-pillar approach to claim management and dispute resolution that runs in parallel from the mobilization day one through the final resolution. So I will walk you through these 5 pillars. So the first pillar is the early identification. From the moment of mobilization, we map contract risk across the full scope of work, establish a notice register with automated alerts so that no deadline is missed. We embed the proactive claim identification within the project delivery team rather than leaving it to a separate commercial function, and hold monthly risk review meetings to keep the commercial picture current and visible to the project leadership. It should not be the case that the things are dormant in the beginning and then they blow up after a few days. The pillar 2 is the contemporaneous record. So it's the daily diary protocols, as Fernanda was saying, they have the template for that. So a daily diary protocol can be established from the day one, covering site conditions, resource deployment and access. And nowadays, with the advancement of technology, we can have various kind of documentation in the form of graphics, videos, etc. Photographic evidences are also setting a high standards which enforce consistently throughout the project. A program monitoring system tracks progress against the baseline in the real time. And correspondence management ensures that every instruction, decision, or response is captured in a way that creates a complete and auditable trail. The pillar 3 is the forensic analysis. So the time impact analysis and window analysis are developed at the outset of the project and not retrospectively, once the dispute has emerged. Measured mile productivity analysis is applied wherever output rates are relevant to the claim. Critical path integrity checks are conducted at regular intervals to ensure the program remains a reliable forensic tool. And what if scenario modeling is used to test claim position before they are formally submitted. So the team understands both the strength and the vulnerability of each position in advance. The pillar 4 is quantum buildup. As I told about the lessons learned, that the cost is to be coded item by item from the start, ensuring that each and every expenditure is traceable to a specific scope or event. Actual costs are compared against tender rates throughout the project lifecycle, not only at the point of claim preparation. Overhead and profit methodology is developed and documented upfront, so it cannot be challenged as retrospective construction. And interest and finance charge calculations are maintained from the point at which loss is first incurred and not at the end when we are doing any retrospective analysis. The pillar 5 is the dispute resolution. The DAB and adjudication strategy is considered from contract commencement, not only when a dispute has already crystallized. Expert witness selection and management is handled proactively to ensure the right expertise is in place before it is urgently needed. ICC, LCIA arbitration support is available across all major international seats, and settlement negotiation support is provided across the full resolution pathway, from its first commercial conversation through to the final agreed resolution. These 5 pillars are not sequential. As you can see, they are independent and run in parallel, which is precisely why activating them late or once a dispute has crystallized produces weaker outcome. As we say that if any cost is not recorded, it has not been incurred. So this brings us to the next slide about the global lessons learned, but also applicable across the regional expertise. Next, please. Yeah, so here the same fundamental principles apply whether we are operating from Dubai or from Brazil. But the procedural and legal nuances differ substantially, and those nuances are material to how a claim is argued and decided. For example, for us in GCC and Middle East, FIDIC dominates. DAB is increasingly utilized. The DAIC, SCCA arbitral seats are growing in prominence. So these two nuances that the practitioner learn quickly in this region are the engineer's role, as defined in the contract, is more often constrained in practice than the FIDIC drafting implies, and the employer-driven contract amendments are common. That is, you need to know precisely what you have actually signed and how it differs from the standard form. Claim notices are strictly enforced by the local courts. Converha operates directly in Qatar and UAE with the deep knowledge across GCC with these nuances. Now I pass on to Fernanda to detail about the market in Brazil.
Thinking about Brazil, maybe the main difference that we have when you think about arbitration procedures is that it's very common in Brazil to have an expert appointed by the tribunal, and that can ultimately result in longer procedures. Although the market is going through a change at the moment, and it has become less common for us to see an expert appointed by the tribunal, it still happens more frequently than what we see happening in other countries like Europe and America and North America. So that's one of the differences that we have. It's also very common for us to see in contracts a mandatory mediation or conciliation phase before starting the arbitration. That is ultimately also aligned with these changes that we're seeing in the market, and basically the main conclusion is that it's always better to reach an agreement and to manage to negotiate the claims before actually taking them to arbitration. So the parties are more inclined to do a mediation or to try out one of these phases before actually starting the arbitration, and that has also become very common in some of the contracts that we see. Like Gunjan said, that outside of Brazil, it's very common for you to have the FIDIC contracts being used in Brazil. Although we have a lot of contracts that are FIDIC, it's not as common as in other countries. We are having an increase in the use of those contracts due to a lot of international investments that have entered Brazil, but they are still not as common as in other countries. So for us, it's very common to see specific types of contract because we have a lot of big owners in Brazil, like Vale or Petrobras, and they usually have very specific clauses that in some ways they try to mirror some of the obligations that we have on the FIDIC contracts, but they make some specific changes and kind of apply it to specific scenarios from Brazil. So it is also very important to be aware of what those specific agreements are in each one of these contracts, because they tend to be very specific, and they also tend to increase the level of obligation and responsibility that the contractor has. So it's very important to be aware of what those obligations are. So, we have a lot of similarities to what's happening in other countries. The market is definitely evolving, but there are still some specific changes that we need to be aware when we talk about contracts, specifically in Brazil. You can move on to the next slide. So We've summed up some of the main takeaways that we have discussed over the presentation. And I will summarize, but I guess that the main takeaway that we have is that these problems and these claims, they are usually won or lost before the arbitration even begins. The documents and the records that we have are definitely one of the main pillars that will determine whether you win or you lose a arbitration procedure. Of course, it doesn't matter having those documents if these documents will show that you didn't comply with the obligations that you had. So that is also very important. So it's important to be aware of the contract during the execution itself. And of course, it doesn't matter if you have all the right documents, but you have an expert that is not willing to do the correct analysis. And for us, specifically in Brazil, it's important to use very well established and very well acknowledged methodology so that we can definitely prove the reasons for the delay, so that we can correctly quantify the cost that results from those delays, and definitely have an expert that gives the necessary credibility to any technical analysis that can be done. It's important for the expert to be able to translate all of the technical matters to the tribunal, and not just the tribunal, but the lawyers as well, because they will be making the main points of the case and defining the strategy along with the expert. So it's important for them to understand all the work that was done by the expert. And if the expert can't really translate that into a way that all the involved parties will understand, all the work is pretty much lost. So it's important to be very clear with the technical analysis, and also to a certain degree, a little impartial. I mean, I'm not going to say all the way, because in Brazil, we definitely have a culture of doing within the necessary constraints of any technical analysis, it's important to also be aligned with the strategy that was decided by the lawyers and by the client at the end of the day. But as long as you're within the correct methodology and within the correct standard of technical analysis that needs to be done, it is also important to not overstep and in certain ways become almost as the lawyer to the client. It's very important to be attached to those limits, to those technical limits that the analysis has, so that you do give credibility to the tribunal. So don't become a lawyer, act as the expert. So be aligned with be aligned with the strategy, but also it's important to comply with all the methodology constraints and all the technical procedures that need to be done. And that's pretty much what I had. I don't know if Gunjan wants to add something to the takeaways.
As exactly you said, Fernanda, about the expert works and about the other documentation, basically it sums up what we have to do right from the inception and then at the end. So generally, expert appointment will not come into picture. The dispute will not come into picture if the things are properly administered. But when it comes to the expert work, as you rightly pointed out, we should not be the lawyers, but we should be the expert, impartial. And as we also say that the report that always needs to be drafted should be in such a fashion that it is understood by a 10-year-old kid, so that it is understood by each and every party in the project. So, well, that sums up everything. Thanks.
So in the next slide, we just have some of the ways that Exxata and Converha can also help you if you have one of those claims, if you have one of these disputes. And that is pretty much what we had to present today. Andre, I don't know if you want to go through some of the questions that we had on the chat, and also if anyone else wants to send questions through the chat, we will be happy to answer them.
I think there is some questions from Roberto. If you can read, translate in English to you.
I've read them, and pretty much some of the questions that Roberto has are regarding how the FIDIC contracts are being used in Brazil. The case studies that I presented, that are the Brazilian cases, they are not FIDIC contracts. They are Brazilian contracts like I said, some of the Brazilian contracts, they try in a way to mirror some of the obligations that we have under the FIDIC contracts, and we are seeing an increase in the use of the FIDIC itself, but it's still more common for us to see adaptations of the FIDIC contract than the FIDIC contract itself when we think about Brazil. Specifically, the Silver Book. I personally haven't seen a contract in Brazil that had the Silver Book. And in my opinion, I think it's because in the Silver Book, there are a lot of obligations that are placed under the responsibility of the owner. And I'm not so sure if some of the big owners from Brazil are actually willing to really comply with all those obligations, or to have them so bluntly expressed in the contract as it is in the Silver Book. So it's more common for us to see some adaptations of what the Silver Book should be. And that also creates some of the problems that we sometimes see in disputes, because sometimes in trying to make adaptations, people just end up making clauses that don't really make any sense because you will have one clause that was extracted from the Silver Book, for example, but then you have another clause that the owner or the contracted added to the contract to make it their own, and these clauses do not really speak amongst themselves. So that can also create a lot of problems in disputes. So it's also very important to be aware of those problems when we're negotiating the contract, so that we don't end up having something that doesn't really make sense as a whole. And Roberto, in the chat, you also mentioned that the arbitration that you participated, it lasted for 8 years. I presented some data that says that arbitrations will usually last 15 months, and in Brazil we have the data that says 26 months. But honestly, that's not our experience either. The arbitrations that we deal with, probably because they're so complex, and also because we usually have that role of the appointed by the tribunal expert, they usually last a very long time. The average that we have here within Exxata is usually from approximately 4 to 5 years, but we have some arbitrations that have lasted longer or less. So yeah, they usually last longer. I don't know if Gunjan was able to see the question, and if you want to add something about your own experience.
I did not see the question, but yes, I agree to your point regarding adapting the FIDIC rather than directly practicing the FIDIC. That is the most common thing that happens on a construction project if there is no template. And then the employer kind of starts putting the clauses to save themselves. But end of the day, it is that the clause doesn't make sense in the first place. Yeah. Even if you give a comparison of FIDIC 1999 and then you see the 2017 template. So the older template is more stricter towards the contractor, but when we see the 2017 template, it kind of gives a balance between the contractor and the employer obligation. But yes, even in my experience, it is only once that I have seen FIDIC 2017 being implemented, because the world is still running on 1999 template mode.
Yeah. Same. I don't think we have any other questions. So I tried to summarize all of the questions that Roberto sent into one answer. So
it's okay.
I think
it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for being with us today. A special thanks to Gunjan for a valuable presentation. The content they presented will be available on our site and our social media. Without the case present, but the content will be there. And we hope this webinar was insightful and worthwhile for all of you. And have a nice day or a nice afternoon. And thank you very much for everyone for watching this today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Aos do presente, somos a clareza do futuro. Sabemos que tomar decisões dentro de qualquer fase de um contrato requer coragem, clareza da situação e confiança. Por isso, há mais de 15 anos somos o fio condutor capaz de antecipar e clarificar o futuro do negócio de construção. Somos a Exxata, uma consultoria especializada na gestão de problemas complexos e solução de conflitos. Guiados pelo propósito de prever, apoiar e resolver, contamos com uma equipe qualificada para ajudar na tomada de decisões em qualquer fase de um contrato. Atuamos em todos os setores da engenharia, sempre em defesa dos direitos e interesses de nossos clientes. Trabalhamos ativamente na avaliação de cenários e proposição de ações de impacto. Nos mais de 15 anos de experiência, somamos mais de 1.200 projetos, mais de 500 clientes atendidos em todo o país e mais de 100 profissionais multidisciplinares nos permitem atuar de forma consistente, tempestiva, estratégica e personalizada. Não nos contentamos em ser apenas mais uma opção. Os resultados são notáveis quando as atitudes são imediatas. Reduza suas incertezas com a maior empresa do Brasil de administração contratual. Exxata. Atitude imediata, resultados notáveis.